Our speaker today is Janet Heimlich, and her topic deals with human rights. Janet studied communications at Stanford University and won 9 journalism awards as a freelance reporter for National Public Radio. She is an expert on child abuse that is enabled by religious belief, and the author of Breaking Their Will. This book sheds light on religious child maltreatment. She is also the founder of the Child Friendly Faith Project, a nonprofit charity which works for change in this area. And Janet will come up. As I was saying, she's a world expert on this topic, and I'm sure that all of you will gain important knowledge and new insights relating to religious child maltreatment.
Thank you very much, Marilee, and all of you for having me. In particular, want to thank Marilee and Matt for letting me stay at their lovely home where I consumed the best bowl of oatmeal I think I've ever had in my life. I especially want to express my appreciation for you being here because this is a difficult topic. There are only certain people that really want to learn about it. And as Marilee points out, there are many people out there who would love to find reasons not to discuss it and learn about it. And we'll get into that a little bit later. A lot of people ask me, how did I get into this issue? My background is not someone who grew up with a lot of religion. I had next to no religion in my background. I'm not an expert in child maltreatment or religious studies, but I was a journalist for many years, and when I come across a topic that I feel is very important and very underreported, I just really gravitate to it. And when I learned about some cases relating to religious child abuse and neglect, I just was kind of taken by that and needed to learn as much as I could about it. It's a huge topic, though. A lot of people don't quite understand what it is. Many people are quite aware of maybe their own upbringing in a particular faith. But what I felt was important in writing a book called Breaking Their Will is to tie together the themes that run through all of these cases. And to really understand that, you have to be able to identify what we're talking about. Secondly, who's at risk for this? When is a religious upbringing particularly unhealthy for kids? And then finally, how do we prevent it? So I'm going to cover these 3 in my talk, and then afterwards, of course, we'll have a Q&A time. And at that time, I encourage you to let others know if you've had personal experience with it, whether it's from your own upbringing or a loved one, or I've had people who have talked about their own children raising their kids in a way that the grandparent is particularly concerned. So if you have any kind of stories you want to share, that's always helpful to other people to have an even more deeper understanding of it. Religious child maltreatment is child abuse or neglect that's enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or their surrounding community. It's important to differentiate between what we might call generic or garden variety child abuse and neglect that could be motivated by things like mental illness, poverty, substance abuse, and that which fits this description. Child abuse is almost always a complicated issue in that there are often many factors that go into it. But when someone's religious belief, whether it's the perpetrators or the communities, the households or the victims, is playing a particularly strong role, it's really important to call that out and understand how the influence happens. This is an issue that some experts have nibbled around the edges on and tried to understand better. In 1944, the case of Prince v. Massachusetts came before the Supreme Court, and this was a case where a Jehovah's Witness, a woman, was taking this 9-year-old girl into a public square and having her pass out pamphlets. It seemed innocent enough, except that it was violating child labor laws. And the Supreme Court, in its decision that found that she did violate the law, went a step further and talked about how these kinds of influences could impact children's lives in more than just that narrow instance. What the majority decided was that the right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to ill health or death. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children before they have reached the age of full and legal discretion, when they can make that choice for themselves. This one quote it incorporates so many important lessons that I'll try to unpack in the next 40 minutes or so. A lot of times people wondered, well, just how prevalent is this? I wish that I could say that, there's been a really good study that's, looked at it in a credible way, but unfortunately, we don't have that kind of empirical evidence to draw from. But in researching it, I have found various studies that definitely show that there is a problem. I know you can't read this, but I'm just going to kind of go through some of these studies just to give you an idea of what we do know at this point. A lot of studies have looked at cults, and those have been pretty educational. One in particular reviewed the health status of children in cults and showed that these religious groups had an unusually high incidences of physical abuse, sleep deprivation, and medical neglect. We often think of the Quakers as a very peaceful, loving organization, but because some of those organizations meet certain criteria that we'll talk about a little bit later, they found that they had more acts of violence toward their fathers. Quaker fathers had more acts of violence towards their children than followed the national pattern. A 1995 study, which involved surveys that were sent to mental health professionals who then inquired their patients about their experiences in childhood, gave them all kinds of different things to look at. But what the researcher who put this together ended up finding, and by the way, that woman was a professor, maybe still is, at University of Chicago. Her name is Dr. Betty Bottoms. She saw that they could be categorized in 3 different ways, and they're pretty horrifying. One is torturing or killing a child to rid him or her of evil, withholding needed medical care for religious reasons, and abusing a child under the cover of a religious role. Another study that came out in 1998 looked at medical neglect, specifically religious groups that promote the idea of so-called faith healing to cure children of illness. And what this study found, that there were 172 cases where children had died. Of those, there were 140 where the medical conditions were such that had they been treated, the children would have had a 98% chance of surviving. And then finally, a 2003 study, which was researched by the same woman, Dr. Bottoms, I mentioned earlier, coined the term religion-related abuse, and found that those who suffered from it had more psychological issues than those who suffered from abuse that was not religion-related. When I was looking into this, I really was trying to just wrap my head around this issue and try to make sense of it so that I just, wasn't starting from scratch. We do know a lot about child abuse and neglect. Most professionals break it down into 4 very broad categories. One is physical abuse, another is emotional abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. So what I did with my book was I used that as a framework to try to show how these particular crimes manifest themselves in a religious setting. So we can talk a little bit more about how that, what that looks like. Religious sexual abuse. When I often mention the term religious child maltreatment to somebody, the first thing they almost always say is, oh, you mean like in the Catholic Church? When it comes to religiously enabled sexual abuse, there have been religions and groups that actually promote the idea of sex between adult and child with their doctrines. It's not very common. In terms of the cases we're more familiar with, like in the Catholic Church, the crime isn't so much the sexual abuse itself that's religiously enabled, but covering it up, preventing a victim from getting his or her needs taken care of, and also exposing a child to a dangerous situation. So a typical situation would be a parent who is just thrilled that their son or daughter is being allowed to spend so much time with a particular priest because of that parent's belief system about what, a priest's so-called connection with the deity, that they will expose that child to harm. But as I said, there have been some groups. One is the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Fundamentalist Mormon group, which essentially believes that it's required for men to marry many virgins. So you had that religion almost codifying underage marriage. As I said, the biggest issue really is the failure of religious organizations to report sexual abuse of children. This is still the case, and some religious leaders are very outspoken about how they will even go to jail rather than report cases of sexual abuse. Very recently, this particular archbishop who spoke out about the idea of reporting cases that he learned about in confession, he is with the Archdiocese of Melbourne, which incidentally just had a very high-profile case where the cardinal, a guy named George Pell, it looks like he is now going to be prosecuted for himself being a perpetrator, and this is one of the first cases where a high-ranking person who was closely tied to the Pope is very likely going to be prosecuted for his crimes or alleged crimes. But this guy, Dennis Hart, said that he believes confession is an absolute sacrosanct communication of a higher order that priests by nature respected is perhaps the only opportunity where a person who has offended or a child who has been hurt can have the opportunity for broader advice. So it's essentially justifying a failure to report child sexual abuse with his religious belief. And we don't always know if these people really believe what they're saying, but the fact is they're spouting religious beliefs as a way to justify their behavior. Physical abuse and a lot of these other crimes you will see happen in more conservative religious communities. When in the United States, physical abuse almost always stems from this idea that I have the right to hit my child or beat my child because it says so in Proverbs of the Bible. Oftentimes they will say, spare the rod, spoil the child, not realizing that that phrase does not even exist in the Bible. This picture that I have here is from an evangelical type Christian website where they, very openly promote the idea that part of being a Christian means you have to spank your kid. And we've seen all kinds of horrible cases where children have died from these, quote, Bible-based beatings. And in some cases, the pastors who've been promoting the idea have gone to jail. Ritual abuse isn't, one of the categories that I mentioned, but when it comes to religiously enabled maltreatment, it's pretty common, and I kind of see it as a category in and of itself, so I kind of separate it out. What you're seeing here is a ritual that happens in Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities called Mitzvah B'Peh. Is anyone here familiar with it or has heard about it? Okay. The first part of this ritual is male circumcision, where a mohel will remove perfectly healthy tissue from a baby's penis, which is in itself quite a violation and abusive. But then they go a step further because they believe that this is something that is required of their faith. The mohel will suck the wound. Well, in most statutes, it's illegal to do that to a child. But because of preferences that our laws give to religious organizations, it is legal everywhere in the U.S. to do that. Even though there have been a number of babies who have contracted herpes simplex 1 this way. And a newborn that contracts herpes can die from it, and some have. Some have gotten severe brain damage. But regardless of that, no one has sought to ban the practice. My guess is that many people here are familiar with medical neglect cases. They often are very high profile because oftentimes they're so disastrous, so dangerous that children can die from it. Unfortunately, we only hear about those high-profile cases. We don't hear about the millions of children who suffer day in and day out from being denied medical care. If you can imagine, as a child, when you had a headache, I had headaches a lot when I was a kid. I think maybe probably just from dehydration or something. I was given an aspirin. The idea to have to suffer in pain just for a headache seems unconscionable. Children also are made to suffer with broken bones. They are made to suffer with diabetes, with infections, and lots of very treatable illnesses. There's a particular church in Idaho and in other states called the Followers of Christ. They are probably the most dangerous church group in the United States when it comes to religious medical neglect of children. Like some of these groups, they believe that it's wrong and also not only against their religion, but you're colluding with Satan if you were to seek medical care. Some of the adults go ahead and do it anyway, but because it looks bad in their church for it to get out that they may be taking their child to a doctor, they usually will exploit their child's illness and deny their child that same benefit. So we've seen many cases of children dying in that church from treatable illnesses. This 15-year-old girl in 1990, let's see, I'm having a hard time, 1996? Okay. She died from getting food poisoning, where she was vomiting so much and no one gave her medical care for this, that after several days, She became so dehydrated and continued to vomit that she ended up dying from a ruptured esophagus. No one was prosecuted in this case, as is the case with every other child death case that's happened in Idaho, because the laws protect parents who allow their children to die this way because the legislature allows it. You may be interested to know that just about every state has similar laws. They're called religious exemptions. But in Idaho, where you have this very powerful church, we see the most deaths there. There have been states that have repealed those religious exemptions, and in those states there have been next to no child deaths, whereas before there were many. Just to give you an idea of how legislators actually support this idea of denying children medical treatment for religious reasons, I have a quote here by this one legislator who said at a legislative hearing that basically they were doing dead children a favor by not requiring that their parents deliver them medical care. He said, those children that have gone on, they're probably where we're all trying to get. They're there. They've got it made. If we can just live a righteous life, one day we'll be with them again. Again, justifying horrendous acts with religious doctrine. This category, religious emotional abuse, I think sometimes gets the least attention, although I think it's the most pervasive. There are 4 types of emotional abuse that I focus on in my book. One is terrorizing, another is spurning, and then you also have isolating and exploiting. I can go into those a little bit more if people have questions about it, but I think you can pretty much see how religious messages can be used to frighten children, make them feel that they're less than, prevent them from having access to people who are non-believers or the internet, as well as exploiting, which is kind of when you live your life, or in this case your religion, through a child. This is a pastor of a Baptist church in North Carolina named Sean Harris, who got into a whole lot of trouble when one of his sermons about raising children was recorded. Now, you're probably familiar with how so many conservative churches will rail against homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and things like that. Well, what often gets a little less attention is what kinds of belief systems go on in these churches and other religious communities where they use terrorizing and spurning tactics to oppress children and not allow them to be the people that they are. And this is particularly true with children who are gay. Or identify as transgender, or, sort of identify themselves in a way that's like just not the norm that has been established by the religious organization. In this sermon I'm going to play for you, he actually advocates violence as a way to prevent children from expressing themselves as gay.
Oh, your little son starts to act a little girlish when he's 4 years old, and instead of squashing that like a cockroach and saying, man up, son, get that dress off you and get outside and dig a ditch, because that's what boys do. You get out the camera and you start taking pictures of Johnny acting like a female, and then you upload it to YouTube and everybody laughs about it, and next thing you know, this kid is acting out childhood fantasies that should have been squashed. Can I make it any clearer? Dads, the second you see your son dropping the limp wrist, you walk over there and crack that wrist. Man up. Give him a good punch. Okay? You're not going to act like that. You were made by God to be a male, and you're going to be a male. And when your daughter starts acting too butch, you rein her in. And you say, oh no. Oh no, sweetheart. You can play sports. Play them. Play them to the glory of God. But sometimes you're going to act like a girl and walk like a girl and talk like a girl and smell like a girl. And that means you're going to be beautiful. You're going to be attractive. You're going to dress yourself up. You say, can I take charge like that as a parent? Yeah, you can. You're authorized. I just gave you a special dispensation this morning to do that.
You heard the adults responding to him, sometimes laughing, sometimes clapping. I think there was also some sounds that, to me, made it seem like some were uncomfortable. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but parents like that, they're a big part of the problem. If you find yourself talking about this issue with people, especially people who are of faith, you will oftentimes hear, I would say, 5 categories of responses as a way to deflect it, as a way to not talk about it anymore. The first one, and I'll preface this by saying, the quotes that I'm going to show to you are from a conversation in a Facebook group where there was someone or some people who were talking about Jehovah's Witnesses and their experiences and calling out the abuses that they experienced. And then you had all these people who were still in the religion combating what they were saying. And this one Facebook conversation just kind of provided some quotes that fill all 5 of these categories. The first one, everything about religion is great. Nothing bad happens in religion. So this woman said, I've been studying the Bible with JW for over a year, and what they teach is what is in the Bible. How can you knock people for doing that? How can you go wrong doing what Jesus did? That is peace, love, kindness for all. This is the most common one. It's just a few bad apples. Let's just blame those individuals, those abusive priests. Nothing wrong with the Catholic Church. There's nothing systemic that's problematic. It's just the individuals who are doing the bad deeds. So this person says, there were bad people in all organizations. Abuse cases are serious. But again, we hear this in many Catholic communities too. It's not religion-based. It's people who commit these crimes. I hope people can understand that they are good people. Sadly, we have bad people too. Well, what can you do? Myth 3, they're just the haters. Don't listen to them. Probably former believers who were bitter. So they just kind of have this problem, and we should ignore them and not listen to survivors. This person said, remember, an apostate's goal is one of self-justification and to frighten the general public. So they're willing to say any and everything. This is a pretty common one. We're the victims. You're persecuting us for just being part of a faith. You're the problem. We're not the problem. This is absolute rubbish. Not all JW are this way. You get good and bad in all religions. My granny is a JW and has been for over 40 years. You wouldn't meet a nicer, honest, loving lady if you tried. And finally, and this, I would say, is said very often by well-meaning religious folks who recognize there's a problem but don't want to take any ownership of it, who want to believe that it only happens in the most extreme groups and is not a mainstream religious problem at all. So That leads to a big question, I think, that everyone should ask about this, which is, well, is all religion bad for kids? When does it get to a really unhealthy point? Is it wrong for my child to go with her friend to the friend's church, family's church? And then it also looks at the other side, which is, okay, I'm raising my child. She's going to a religious school. Is that a problem? I believe in what I believe. Should I not be teaching my child anything about that? Should I be, covering it all up? I spent a lot of time looking at many criminal cases and reading a lot of studies, and I interviewed dozens of people who have been personally affected by this issue, as well as experts. And it was really important to me to differentiate between an unhealthy religious environment and one that is not problematic. And what I concluded is that there are 3 perfect storm factors that need to be going on in the environment that a child is being raised in for it to get to the level of abuse or neglect that's religiously enabled. And I call those environments religious authoritarian cultures. And in religious authoritarian cultures, whether it's a household or whether it's a community or a huge religious organization, if the child's environment encompasses a very strict social hierarchy, if it's very fear-based, or if the members are socially separatist, children are going to be in trouble. And the more these factors come into play, the more dangerous the community is. I think that, these pretty much speak for themselves. I'll just say one thing about the fear-based aspect, because I think most of us are familiar with doctrines that seem to threaten some kind of punishment in the afterlife. You have, for example, in Jehovah's Witnesses, they will talk about, they've had so many prophecies of the world coming to an end. Usually it's like right around the corner, and children are raised to believe these kinds of things. In other faiths, you have, the end times, the apocalypse, hell. But in addition to that, you've got this fear-based component happening with punishment in this life, where religious organizations often impose some kind of punishment if you just don't abide by the rules. So back to the JW example, they talk about disfellowshipping. Others talk about excommunication, shunning, and just ostracization. So there's also a social component to this fear-based system if you don't do what's expected of you. This is a painting by Rembrandt of Abraham getting ready to sacrifice his son Isaac. And I look to Abraham as kind of the poster, what I call middle manager parent. When I talked a little bit earlier about those parents who were hearing the pastor talk about harming children who appear to be gay, and I said that they are a big part of the problem. Middle manager parents, these are parents who, for various reasons, don't have full autonomy in their decision making and will therefore abide by the rules of their religious organization, which might involve harming children. And so I kind of think that Abraham set the mold for that by being willing, because he thought that God told him to do it, to try to kill his son. This woman named Lauren Drain, she was raised in the Westboro Baptist Church. Some of you may be familiar with this, very conservative church that hates all people who are gay and hates America for passing laws that protect people who are gay. And she got kicked out of her house for doing some things that were against the rules. And the church kicked her out as well. Everybody colluded together to send her on her way, even though that was the only support system she had, the only social network she had in her life. And what she said to someone who did a documentary on this, some people lose their parents to cancer or car accidents or other things. I've lost my parents to a cult. Middle manager phenomenon. This is a gentleman named Jerry Minor. He's a pretty well-known actor who's been on some HBO shows and so forth, and he was, not to pick on Jehovah's Witnesses, but that was the religion he was raised in. And so I recorded this interview with him, and I wanted to play it for you, and I want you to just kind of listen to some of the different examples he talks about in his life, and you'll see how they resonate with some of the things that I've run across, I've discussed with you.
And then as it goes on, it seemed like everything from school, what I was studying in school, even to where we lived, seemed to be kind of predicated on this organization that we had gotten involved in. And then I've started to also be taught. So I'm going to 5 meetings a week. Also, I have my mother, she was encouraged to study the publications with me. So I'm also being indoctrinated, so to speak, during that time. So my mother at least would take at least an hour a week to sit me down and go through publication. A lot of these publications that they have are based, for young people. So she would get a book that was for a young person, and she would sit down and try to study that with me. And then, as time goes on, she even went to, my mother was a uber Jehovah's Witness, so she took it to the farthest extent. I mean, she was teaching me the deepest things about that organization and their philosophy and their theology at a really early age. I mean, I think I knew a lot of things at 10 or 11 years old. And a lot of that was really disconcerting. A lot of it I did not want, and vocally, like, say, I don't want to know this. Family. I still consider my mother abusive. I got beat a lot, and those were usually for behavioral things, for lying or not doing the chores or whatever. But I can say that it was better after she became a Jehovah's Witness. She seemed to have a little bit of better handle on her anger and outburst. But it definitely did not end it. It just made it a little bit different. Yes, they do encourage physical discipline, but they also encouraged more than that. And I will say this: there was an incident when I was growing up of a friend of mine who the child welfare services got called on, and I saw my mother's behavior actually change after that. But it wasn't like it was great. I mean, I still got beat, and I still think that the organization condoned that kind of thing. They definitely were. They definitely had the mantra, spare the rod, spoil the child. I mean, that was. I remember as a child in this incident that I'm talking about, a friend of mine, when the state was called in, as far as to see if she was being abused. I remember feeling like, well, I don't know why they're doing that to the parent. She's totally justified in beating her child because the Bible says that we can do that. I remember as a child feeling that way. I saw so many children that were, that got corporal punishment used against them, physical punishment used against them in the Kingdom Hall. And it's something that people don't talk about. And since there's just an overall okay with corporal punishment, I thought that there was a real lack of really watching for children's well-being. at a certain time, I started to, around age 19, 18, I started to have, not necessarily doubts, but it became really depressed. Obviously, I didn't have a college education. I didn't have a lot of job prospects. And a lot of my friends were starting to have I had a friend that died after not receiving a blood transfusion. And I had a lot of other friends who were having just really a lot of emotional problems and were having a hard time in a lot of different ways. Were succumbing to a lot of different things, drugs and violence, a lot of different things that I didn't expect and was told that I would not see, within this organization, especially with the young people. And so I was starting to become disillusioned, and I found a girlfriend. But in all of that, I was still going to the elders in my congregation and saying, hey, I'm having a problem. I don't know what my problem is. And finally, this was me approaching them and saying, hey, I've got a problem. I want help. Them saying, well, you need to be disfellowship for a while. And that was their formula for bringing me back into it somehow, getting me not disillusioned somehow. Child-friendly means, one of the main things is having a choice, giving a child a choice to what religion that they're going to become. I think that that's important. Every human being should have that. I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's something that wasn't given to me. I wasn't given the choice not to be a Jehovah's Witness. I think that might be disputed. They might say, no, you were given the choice, but I was just given the choice along with losing my family, losing my support. So I don't really think that's a fair choice. And to keep in mind, the children don't necessarily and shouldn't be making the commitments that adults are making. The adults have experience and everything on their side, the legality of being able to make a choice for their future, and children shouldn't be held to that at that age. They should be able to get all the facts and do the same thing that adults have and make their decision on their own on what religion that they're going to be. Obviously, I know that, parents are going to have their children go to services with them. They're going to have them with them. I understand that. But I think that there's also some consideration to letting the child make his own choice. And I think that's important. So if that's done, I think that can help a lot. But also keeping in mind, too, that we are advancing as mankind goes on, and then we've discovered certain things, and we've discovered things about rearing children and corporal punishment, and I think that should have just as much a part of the discussion as the moral part or the whatever text your religion may be adhering to. I think we should also keep in mind what we know. What we know is that are the things that are beneficial for children. We should also keep that in mind along with whatever the Bible says.
That last point that Jerry talked about, what is child-friendly faith? He's talking about intellectual autonomy, allowing children the right to make choices about what kind of information that they receive about supernatural forces, about religion, spirituality, and so forth. I believe in that wholeheartedly, and for that reason, I dedicated my book to children who were denied the right to question. I want to just wrap up with looking at what can we do to try to prevent these cases from happening. And I think what I just want to present are just a few things that to keep in mind if you find yourself in a discussion with someone about the issue, especially if it's someone that doesn't share your same philosophical or religious beliefs. The first is focus on child protection, how these religious influences impact children's lives as opposed to what the theology is of that child's environment. if you kind of get it into this, well, I'm going to tell you why your belief is wrong, as opposed to focusing on how your belief impacts the child, then I think it goes nowhere. I talked a little bit before about the religious exemptions. There are a lot of problems in our laws where they aim to basically protect religious organizations versus children. And there's a whole different set of laws that apply to children who are raised in religious environments versus everybody else. And we really need to even that playing field. In my book, I have a list of questions that parents who are in religious organizations or communities should ask themselves to determine whether or not they're in a religious authoritarian culture. So things like, does your pastor promote the idea of authoritarian parenting, of spanking, or just basically telling you how to raise your kid? If you saw suspected child abuse, would you feel that you would have to tell your religious authority, or do you feel comfortable just going right to, say, reporting it to CPS or outside authorities, things like that? And finally, we just need to educate religious organizations. Now, a year after my book came out, I started a nonprofit organization called the Child Friendly Faith Project. And we have a curriculum that some religious organizations have taken, and they really got a lot out of it. But mostly what we do is we just raise awareness to this issue. And we kind of feel like there are a lot of more liberal believers that feel this is a really important topic and sort of have joined and partnered with us to try to get the information out there. And so we welcome anyone that wants to help us in that effort. And the last thing I want to do is just read a quote to you by a gentleman who, he recently died, but he wrote in his book. This is a guy who was a pastor for 70 years, religious person, but he was a liberal believer. And he wrote this book called Religious Abuse. And what he said is a very important dichotomy that people of faith need to understand. We need to give up the idea that religion is perfect, that the church of which we are a part of is infallible. Religion, like our parents, has the capacity to bless us and to wound us, and it inevitably does both at different times. Only when we're aware of the capacity of religion to abuse can we guard against that abuse and take steps to curb it where it exists. And here's our contact information if you want to get in touch, and I want to thank you so much for having me.
Hi, I was wondering if you have run into any instances with the reparative therapy that a lot of these religions promote. Reparative therapy, you know, things they do to supposedly make people not gay.
Yeah, the gay conversion stuff, yeah. I mean, I really just follow it in the news, you know, for the most part, but it's, I think it's some religious groups' attempts to appear legitimate by bringing in the psychological component, but it really is just carrying out their agenda, which is to try to control young people and have everyone behave the same way because they're easier to, you know, have them stay in line if they give them a very, you know, strict menu of ways to behave. So it kind of just goes along with that, you know.
There you go. Thanks for a great talk. I certainly agree that these religious freedom laws are a major problem, but occasionally lawsuits are filed by maybe a third party or whatever, and in the arguments, does the standing of the religion have a relevance? Like, in other words, if it's a long-standing type religion like Jehovah's Witnesses, is that more relevant than maybe just somebody that personally feels way that doesn't belong to a major religion? Is that a factor, or is it just my religious beliefs are what they are and that's all that matters? If you follow what I'm saying.
I do, yeah. And it depends on the state. If the way that would impact things is if it's a large religious organization, then they usually will have a strong lobbying effort that gets lawmakers to pass legislation that's favorable to them. But that isn't always the case with really, really big organizations. I mean, you do have, for example, in many states where the Catholic Church has been instrumental in keeping statute of limitations short. Again, you know, not requiring priests to report crimes that they hear about in confession and things like that. But in some more rural states, you can have a relatively small organization be very powerful because of the very conservative nature of the communities. The politicians can gain a lot of votes by appearing religion-friendly. So the state of Idaho would be a perfect example of that, where you can have a legislator say in an open hearing, it's great that these children are dead. That couldn't happen in New York, I don't believe. But it can happen in places like Idaho. So it runs the gamut.
Where does the religious exemption end? So for instance, suppose a religion said that we think human sacrifice, 1 out of 100, is a good idea. That clearly wouldn't be permitted. But there must be some boundary. Has the court ever tried to say this is as far as you can go? And what is that boundary?
I think the Supreme Court made a really good effort with that with Prince v. Massachusetts. But that was back in 1944, and since then, that court and many others have become very conservative, and then you have these religious freedom laws that have come up. So unfortunately, I think that decision has been largely forgotten. But they made it very clear that you're an adult, you can make a martyr of yourself, but you can't do that of your child. But we still see laws that are passed that clearly inflict on the rights of children. So I think it very much just has to do with, again, the power of the particular religious organizations that are at play, and what legislators feel they can get out of it politically. The religious exemptions that I talked about before that are in almost every state that have to do with not prosecuting parents or adults that deny children needed medical care, those were put in place largely by high-ranking members of the Nixon administration who were Christian Scientists. At that time, which was in the 70s, it was a very, very large and powerful church. Now, you know, you don't hear as much from Christian Scientists. It's a much more dwindling religion, and for the most part, they don't harm children. I've not run across a child death case in a number of years. In the past, they were responsible for the deaths of many kids. But the damage was done. So when they were powerful, they ended up getting the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to offer these incentives to states that if they didn't pass these religious exemption laws, they wouldn't get federal funding. So that's why we see this in almost every state.
You raise so many questions. I'm particularly interested in the concept of statutory rape. You didn't use that term at all, but I know that wherever there's a power imbalance, like coaches in athletic situations, or the priests with the young children, have any of these cases brought to prosecution? Because statutory rape is a common set of laws, I believe, that have to reach a certain age of consent and all that. Mm-hmm. But I would like to comment on this whole idea of the power relationship between someone who is looked up to by a child and then proceeds to abuse that. And is that a mental illness? Is it common among such situations?
Well, most states will have statutes that do protect children from sexual abuse. When it comes to statutory rape, as you pointed out, that has to do more with consent laws, oftentimes where they're preventing children from getting married too young and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, there have been religious organizations that have been able to carry out underage marriage because their states have such low ages of consent laws. In the state of Texas, where I live, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, Warren Jeffs was their leader. He's now serving a jail term of life after he sexually abused, they would say married, 2 children. One was age 12, one was 14, I believe. And but he, before he got in trouble for doing that, he had been doing this for years in Utah. But he saw that there was advantages of moving out of Utah and moving into Texas. So he had hundreds of his followers go set up a compound in West Texas. And in West Texas, they were not very powerful there because they were new on the scene. So he and 10 other men were convicted of sexual abuse. The only way, though, they were able to criminalize that was by raising the age of consent from 14 to 16. So Texas needed to kind of get with the program before they were able to make all those arrests.
It's a very interesting talk, and as someone who was raised a Catholic, the institutional cover-up aspect of it was the way I usually thought about faith-based maltreatment, and the other aspects you've raised here are really interesting. But you do often talk about the people who are perpetrating this in the terms of they and them, and focusing on the organizational doctrine that leads to this kinds of malfeasance. Do you see a world where religious organizations can exist without this kind of mistreatment happening? Or is it a fundamental problem with a society that accepts freedom of religion?
I actually do feel that there has been this ongoing shift over the last few decades where there have been more and more, there's like a liberalizing of a lot of religious institutions. I mean, one person that's serving on our board is part of the American Catholic Church. It's not recognized by the Vatican, but it is this liberal offshoot of the Catholic Church that accepts people who are gay. And you see a lot of different religious organizations where the members will just start their own congregations that they feel are more tolerant. So I do think that, generally speaking, I think we've been moving more in that direction, and I think that just openness and internet communication has really helped with that. But at the same time, you have this aspect of the population, and I think we've really seen that sprout up over the last number of months since our election, where you have people who are, whether it's for psychological reasons or the way they were raised or what have you, there will always be this extremist fringe of the population. They will always gravitate to a very authoritarian type of structure. And then you will always have people who want to exploit that. So I think we're never going to get away from it. But what I think is so important is, rather than looking at this as a religious problem per se, looking at it as a religious authoritarian problem, that's really the enemy. And I think that that applies not just in terms of child safety, but also, so many adults too are victimized by authoritarian influences, and that's where we really have to combat.
I wanted to hear you talk a little more about people who are allies for you and for your organization. You mentioned towards the end about things we could do, that advocating for the rights of victims is important. And so I'm wondering what sorts of groups or people, what sorts of legislation, what sorts of hopeful things are happening, and who are the people most likely to take up this cause?
I would say The three biggest groups of people who really care about this issue are atheist groups, liberal religious organizations, and survivors. So we have a Facebook group, Child Friendly Faith. It's closed group to protect the protect people who are in there that are still have connections to the faith they grew up in. There are about 700 people in it. And it's a safe place for people to talk about this issue and learn about it and advocate and support each other. So I would say that most of the members are survivors. I think I've mentioned to someone recently, most of the organizations that ask me to come talk tend to be humanist, free thought type organizations. I wish that there were more religious organizations that cared about it, but I will say that I have been asked to talk at some more liberal churches and things like that, and I think that we can open that up a lot more. Just because someone has a strong adherence to a faith that means a lot to them, that doesn't mean that they feel they have to have their child believe that same thing. And I think those adults who are able to draw that separation and recognize that autonomy, the intellectual autonomy that children deserve, really get this. And I really appreciate support from those people.
Okay, this will be our last question.
Thank you. Oh, yeah. This will be good too, I promise. I was really struck by the quote at the beginning, or near the beginning, about confession. And I'm wondering if most states' mandatory reporting laws include religious leaders like priests and rabbis, et cetera, as people who come into contact with children, and if they hear about or suspect abuse, they have to report that.
It really runs the gamut, where you have states like, for example, that are hugely, where there's a very powerful lobby, like by the Catholic Church or the LDS Church, that they will not require religious authorities to report crimes that are heard in confession. Then you have states that say that clergy are mandatory reporters, just like teachers and lawyers and doctors. So it, as I say, it just really runs the gamut there. But that is one type of legislation that I think really requires a lot of attention. They have teachers and doctors and people like that to be mandatory reporters. Why? Because they spend a lot of time with children. You have a priest that'll go have, dinner with a family. I mean, those individuals learn a lot about family dynamics. They are an ideal person to learn about when there's suspected maltreatment. So I believe every state should require clergy to be mandated reporters.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet.